Hey APUSHers, so we are in period 4 and this is frame number 2. Um, so the big picture, what we've been doing is we've been looking at period 4 in terms of nationalism and sectionalism. And we transitioned yesterday in the last video to sectionalism with the American identity of slavery. So slavery not only was something that was built into our political culture, uh, you know, in a bad way, it also served to divide this emerging country. So whenever you think of sectionalism in period 4, I want you to think of slavery, and I want you to think of the second party system. So these are two divisive issues uh, that characterizes period 4. All right, so remember we were in the first party system. And this is where we have two factions. They're not actual political parties. Each believed that they were the only group representing all of Americans. We have on the one hand the Federalists, and they were big on economic growth, increased power, centralizing government. And then you had the Democratic Republicans, who were the party of the common man, small agrarian society, the yeoman independent farmer. And Thomas Jefferson, of course, being a Democratic Republican and subsequently James Madison. But what we saw happening under Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, uh, uh, James Monroe, what we saw was that these Democratic Republicans were becoming like the Federalists, promoting economic growth and tariffs and centralizing government and taking on more power. And so now we're starting to see kind of these two groups merge. The Democratic Republicans and the Federalists, they merge under the one party system. And they're known as the National Republicans. Right? So what we're going to start to see happen as we go into this sectionalism, the second party system, is we're going to see that the National Republicans are going to find a rival in an emerging group of people who want to represent the common man. So, um, so this divide, it demonstrates a political divide between the National Republicans, who were gonna become the Whigs, spoiler, and the emerging Democrats, who are gonna be the party of the common man. And they're going to argue over regional interests, the American system, which you may recall the American system, it's all about infrastructure, national transportation, a system of roads, canals, bridges, transportation in terms of steamships, river ships, encouraging industry and self sufficiency. It's all about protective tariffs, because when I say tariffs, stimulate domestic industry. And there were a series of tariffs that were passed during this time. One is the tariff of 1824. Then there's going to be the tariff of 1828. And then the tariff of 1832. So realize lots of tariffs during this time. And then also maintaining the second bus. Remember, James Madison brought back the bus in terms of the second bus. And now these National Republicans have maintained it. All right. So the emergence of the second party system, that story really starts with the election of 1824 and the corrupt bargain. So in this election, we're going to see a number of candidates running, 4 actually, the 3 most prominent of which was John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts. He was the current Secretary of State, son of John Adams. Henry Clay from Kentucky, he was Speaker of the House. And both John Quincy and Henry Clay both supported the American system. Then there was our kind of weird candidate here, Andrew Jackson from Tennessee. He became popular because he was a war hero, and he had more popular support and electoral votes than any of the other candidates. But remember, in our American political structure, we need to have a majority, which is 50 plus 1. So because this election, no one could get to that 50 plus 1 mark, according to the 12th Amendment, the presidency, the election results go into the House of Representatives. Here are the election results. And as you can see, no one gets to that 50 plus 1 vote. So it goes to the House of Representatives. Now, who is Speaker of the House? Oh, that's right, it's Henry Clay. So Henry Clay really can't choose himself. So it's between really Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. And so, because John Quincy also supported the American system, and Jackson was kind of an outsider, Henry Clay goes and chooses John Quincy Adams, and John Quincy Adams chooses him, Henry Clay, as the Secretary of State, which at this time is basically passing the baton to the next president. So everyone yells, corrupt bargain. This was a corrupt bargain. Andrew Jackson should have taken it because he got more electoral votes and more popular votes. But a backroom deal was struck between John Quincy and Henry Clay. So Jackson supporters are going to start to rise up, and they're going to form what will become the Democratic Party. So the Jacksonians, as we call them, followers of Jackson, are going to play oppositional politics. So anything that the John Quincy Adams' administration wants to do, they will oppose it, even if it's in the best interest of the country. So the American system was an example of something brought up by the John Quincy Adams' administration that Jacksonians in Congress are going to block. Another is the 1826 Panama Conference, in which we would go send representatives to South America, and we would participate in the South American Conference. But again, Jacksonians, largely in the South, are going to delay. Another tariff. So the tariff of 1828 was also passed, or I'm sorry, was also proposed. It's also known as the Tariff of Abomination, raising the protective tariff 45 cents, 45% on the dollar. And this, of course, is going to benefit merchants, the elite, the wealthier people, as opposed to, as we all know, tariffs tend to raise consumer prices. So this is upsetting the Jacksonians, but this one actually did get passed. So again, we're seeing a lot of tension growing between the Jacksonians and the National Republicans. So this is going to result in the emergence of the second party system. And one of the positive repercussions of the emergence of a second party system is the idea that it's going to lead to more voter participation. So the common man are going to be like, wow, we're royally getting screwed here. We really need to participate in this democracy in order for our interests as the common man to be represented. So we're going to have two emerging groups. Of course, the former National Republicans, now called the Whigs, led by Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, John Quincy Adams. And you all already know what they believe in. Strong, centralized national government. They favored the bus, tariffs, internal improvements, industry. They tended to be more of the moral police. They're going to support prohibition. They're going to support abolition. And they were largely from the Northeast. And they were elite. The Democrats. This is going to be led by the Jackson and John C. Calhoun. They believed not in a strong national government, but in states' rights, right? That power should lie more distinctly with the states and to restrain federal power. They tended to favor, more than anything else, individual liberty, right? What are the rights of the individual? And they didn't like that the elite had such control, so they were fiercely against the inroads of privilege. And they were supported largely by the South and the West, and their idea was to protect the common man. All right, so like I said, one of the things that we're going to see as a result of the emergence of the second party system is a more participatory democracy. So, with Jackson supporters continuing to play oppositional politics and growing in strength and number, Jackson will win the next election, and John Quincy was made into a one-hit wonder. So the election of 1828 is kind of another revolution, like the one in 1800, where Thomas Jefferson brought the common man back to the presidency. Same thing here with Andrew Jackson. And part of his big political agenda was to end corruption, end the power of the Eastern elite, right? To eliminate national debt, to reinstitute states' rights. He was also against King Caucus. So Andrew Jackson believed that candidates were often chosen in the back room of some DC, smoke filled back room of some DC saloon. And it just kind of passed the baton to the various elite. Instead of a caucus system, Andrew Jackson proposed the National Nominating Convention, where we would basically hold a rally. Everyone would go to a particular city for a week, and they would, if they wanted to throw their name in the ring, they would deliver a speech, and everyone present would vote. The winner would be the Democratic nominee. Again, this is better than the caucus system, but still, who has the time to be able and the money to travel? The other thing that is going to keep the Democrats sustaining is something called the spoils system. This is patronage, where elected officials appointed their own followers to public office. So this gained loyalty among the constituents, and it's now an established feature of American politics. So, regional self interests, we're going to start to see these really emerge, the North versus the South. And everyone kind of represented their own region's interest. And this is going to trump national concerns. What's good for the nation? Who cares? It's what's good for my region. So, we're going to start to see that emerging. And then, the issue of slavery is going to rear its ugly head, as well as economic policy. So let's talk about the states' rights kind of thing. So John C. Calhoun was from South Carolina, and there was an event known as the nullification crisis. And nullification is the idea that you, as a state, can nullify or make void a national piece of legislation if it's in conflict with 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 your state. So the nullification theory is based on the compact theory. This is John Locke's idea that stated that since the federal government was a creation by the states, not the courts or Congress or anything at the national level, it's the states that were the final authority on the constitutionality of federal law. And so Congress had passed the another tariff. Remember, there was the initial tariff of 1824, then the tariff of 1828, which is the tariff of the abomination. And now they passed the tariff of 1832, and South Carolina said, okay, we're done. So they voted to nullify not only the tariff of 1832, passed at the national level, but then while we're at it, let's get rid of the tariff of abomination, the tariff of 1828. And so this created a problem because John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, I may have forgotten to mention, was also the vice president of the United States under Andrew Jackson. And so when John C. Calhoun threatened to nullify, Jackson says, you can't nullify. This is a piece of national legislation. I've got to keep this union together. You can't just nullify. And so John C. Calhoun says, oh, then we might secede. And Jackson was like, if you secede, we will send the national military down there, and we will institute martial law. So in comes Henry Clay, known as the Great Compromiser, who came up with the compromise tariff. And basically what it said was that we will gradually lower the tariff over time to the level that it was in 1816. So that's a nullification crisis. And this is going to not only deteriorate the relationship between Calhoun and Jackson, but we're also starting to see Jackson taking on more power at the national level, even though he was a Democrat. All right, so the next event under the Jackson administration is going to be the Webster-Hayne debate. And so the Webster-Hayne debate was actually started over the issue of Western land sales. So a Connecticut senator, Sam Foote, proposed to temporarily suspend the further land surveying until land already on the market was sold. This would basically stop Western land sales. So Democrat South Carolina Senator Robert Hayne said, oh, here it goes again, the Eastern elite who are going to try and deny us common people equality of opportunity, but not by denying us access to land. So Daniel Webster, one of those Eastern elite, card-carrying member of the Eastern elite, nationalist from Massachusetts, said, no, 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 we're just trying to do what's in the best interest of the country. And he attacked Robert Hayne and Calhoun for challenging the integrity of the Union. And so the debate ensued over the issue of states' rights versus national power. So what started out as land sales devolves into a states' rights versus national rights um, uh, debate, similar to what we saw with the nullification crisis. All right, so everyone kind of assumed, what are we going to do? Like, where does Jackson stand? We see where he stands on nullification, but he's supposed to be about states' rights. Jackson announced at a Democratic Party banquet that our federal union, it must be preserved. So that's what's going to motivate Jackson from here on out, preserving the union. So the third major event in the Jackson administration, of course, is the Trail of Tears. So the story with the Trail of Tears begins with Thomas Jefferson saying, okay, natives, noble savages, we need you to either assimilate or get out. So a series of what are known as the five civilized tribes in the South, the Cherokee, the Creek, the Seminole, the Chickasaw, and the Choctaw, did it. They assimilated. They started to grow, own their own land, became Christians, adopted um, a democratic style agrarian society, did everything that Thomas Jefferson asked them to do. Unfortunately, they were on valuable land, and as we all know, we see further western expansion of white settlers. So Congress passes the Indian Removal Act under Andrew Jackson passes the Indian Removal Act that basically allocated money to remove the Indians. So the Cherokee, who were so white, they by this point that they went ahead and filed suit against the state of Georgia, who was forcing them to move. So Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. And this was, of course, this was ruled on by John Marshall. Y'all remember John Marshall? And John Marshall basically said, and we all know John Marshall was big on federal supremacy. John Marshall basically said, Georgia, back down. Tribes, we're finally going to go give a definition to tribes. Tribes are our ward, our meaning the federal government's ward. We are their protector. And then there was another lawsuit with the Cherokee. It's called Worcester versus Georgia. And this defined tribal sovereignty. So Georgia and all the other states, you have no sovereignty over the tribes. Rather, it's the national government. So the national government is saying, no, Georgia, you can't push these natives out. Jackson, of course, being all about the white common man, not so much about natives or slaves, is quoted as saying John Marshall has made his decision, not let him enforce it. And the result is going to be a forced removal of the Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw natives from from the territories of Georgia and moving towards the Oklahoma Territory, which was the Indian dumping ground in the South. And this is famously known as the Trail of Tears. So speaking of John Marshall is going to make a series of rulings during this time. And we'll see that John Marshall does three major things. All his rulings are about federal supremacy, as we've already said, advancing the interests of the propertied and commercial classes, meaning advancing the interests of the elite. And then third, establishing Native American tribal autonomy over states, right? So it's tribal autonomy over states. And so, as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for 35 years, he's going to make some landmark rulings. Here's some Supreme Court cases that you should probably know that do these things that we've just listed. McCulloch versus Maryland. This said, hey, states, you can't tax the second bus. So Maryland backed down. The second bus is constitutional. Fletcher versus Peck talked about the original contract holder versus the current contract holder. And so this had to do with land in the Yazoo territory in Georgia. And again, Marshall is always going to rule on behalf of advancing the interests of the property and commercial classes. In other words, the original contract holder. Gibbons versus Ogden is a states' rights issue. Who's got more power? Is it the national government or the states? Uh, and in regulating interstate trade, it's going to be the national government. So New Jersey and New York, sorry, stand down. Then Johnson versus McIntosh, and this had to do with Native Americans in the state of Georgia. And so the federal government basically said, "Hey, Georgia, you can't require people to uh, to you can't require natives living in reservations to register with the state." So the federal government is in charge of natives, not the state. All right. This is going to actually be our last main idea. There's no D here, just C. All right, so by the 1820s and 30s, the Democrats and the Whigs disagreed about the question of sovereignty. Who should have it? Should it be states or should it be the national government? All right, so we're going to deal a little bit more with economic policy here. And so remember that the second bus began operating in 1816. Madison resurrected it. And it was, of course, chartered for another 20 years. So it's set to expire in 1836. And Andrew Jackson wanted to get rid of the bus. But at this point in time, the bus was alive and well. It's right now it is 1832, so the bus isn't set to expire for another 4 years. And so the bus driver at this point was a guy named Nicholas Biddle. And the bus driver had been operating the bus, and the bus was very sound, very prosperous. But Jackson believed that the bus advanced the interest of the Eastern elite and it hurt the common man. So Jackson was gunning to get rid of it in 1836, and Biddle knew it. So what will commence is known as the Bank Wars. So a plan was hatched by Nicholas Biddle to introduce to Congress with the help of Daniel Webster and Henry Clay. Uh, a plan was hatched to introduce a bill before Congress called the Renewal Bill, 1832, to renew the bus in 1832 before it's set to expire. So we can call it a proposed third bus. Henry Clay, at the time, was going to run for president to challenge Andrew Jackson. And knowing that the renewal bill most likely pass, but of course will be vetoed by Andrew Jackson. And when that happens, Henry Clay planned on making it an issue in the 1832 presidential election. So, the 1832 presidential election, where Jackson is running for a second term, is going to be a mandate on whether we should keep the bus or not. You vote for Jackson, you vote to kill the bus. You vote for Clay, you vote to keep the bus. And of course, the election results. Jackson wins overwhelmingly, and now Jackson wants to destroy the bus. He's not happy now just letting it expire in 36. He wants to kill it now. So the source of the power of the bus is in federal deposits. So Andrew Jackson basically tells his Secretary of Treasury to no longer deposit federal funds in the bus. Instead, put them into these various state pet banks. And the Secretary of Treasury was like, "I can't do that. According to the law, I'm supposed to put it in the bus." And Jackson says, "Well, you're fired." Well, after firing a few people, he finally gets a guy named Roger Taney. Roger Taney, as Secretary of Treasury, is going to go ahead and put the money into state pet banks. And so Nicholas Biddle will retaliate by essentially creating an artificial financial crisis, raising interest rates and reducing the amount of money in circulation, all this kind of stuff, creating a financial distress to prove to Congress that the bus did indeed affect the economy and we needed to keep the bus. But this little artificial recession went on too long, and Eastern elite were like, "Wait, this is actually hurting us." And so Biddle was forced to cave, and Jackson wins. The bus will die. Here's the election results. Jackson winning overwhelmingly over Clay. Poor Clay, always the bridesmaid, never the bride. All right, so speaking of economic policy, we're going to go to state pet banks. And as we know, state pet banks typically are not as regulated because there's so many of them. So There was the age-old issue of soft money versus hard money. Remember, farmers like soft money. They like paper currency because the more currency in circulation, the easier it is for them to pay down their debt. So the Democrats tended to support soft money. Hard money, or specie, was supported by the Whigs. They wanted hard currency backed by gold and silver. Yes, that would reduce the amount of money in circulation and tighten credit, but it led to a sounder um, financial policy. It's not as volatile. The value of gold and silver does not change erratically. So they liked hard currency. So the big question was, what did Jackson support? Well, interestingly, Jackson supported hard money. He believed the common man needed coins, hard currency with a fixed value based on gold and silver, to avoid being cheated as the value of paper money rose and fell. So, like one day you would go in and buy a sack of flour and it costs $5, the next day it costs $10 because the storekeeper were like, yeah, that's just what it costs. So, to protect the common man, we should have it a little more stable. So, as a result of his supporting of more hard currency, Jackson's going to issue an executive order called the Specie Circular of 1836, an executive order by Jackson, where the government would only accept gold and silver in payment for federal land. So, of course, everyone runs to the bank and trades in their currency for gold and silver, so that they can use that as the currency. This reduces the amount of gold reserves in banks, and it leads to the Panic of 1837. Which was, of course, again caused by a drain on gold and silver reserves and the loss of the second bus in favor of volatile state banks. Now, Jackson's actually going to be leaving office and Van Buren takes control, and Van Buren is the one who's going to have to deal with it. So, Jackson essentially, in the currency issue, leads to the Panic of 1837. Alrighty, that ends our frame. We will pick up with another frame tomorrow. Stay safe, guys.